Hello everyone, I forgot to do the poll again. This time I had a bit of an excuse. The day that I should have put up the poll was my birthday. So I was busy. Am I allowed to be busy on my birthday? Are you going to just accept that? Or are you going to tell me that I have to just be a slave to content every single day, even on my gosh darn birthday? Yeah, birthday. So it was my birthday. That's that. But I think, to be honest, while I could ruminate on and meditate on, another year down, a finite number to go, we could all just sit here and talk about that. Let's actually just get into the video because, we've got a limited amount of time. I'm starting a little bit later than I usually would as well because I'm awful. I'm a bad person and I'm terrible. All right, let's jump in. In case you don't remember, so basically, even though I didn't put up the poll, we're in the middle of responding to something. I kind of wonder whether or not some of you might have, so far, you guys have never voted for me to stop responding to something halfway through. You're yet to do that. However, I feel like in the case of this video, maybe you guys would have, because I don't really know how much there is to engage with in this video. But for those who don't remember, basically, this is a guy responding to me. What I've been doing, just so you're forewarned, if you decide to watch this video in double speed, which I wouldn't blame, or, any kind of sped up speed, which I wouldn't blame you for, I will be speeding up because this guy is responding to my video and as such letting my video play for long portions of time. When he's just watching my video, I will be speeding it up. So there's an outside chance that depending on how I edit it, you might hear some footage of me speaking that sounds like it's incredibly fast if you're listening to this video yourself at increased speed, because obviously that would be multiplying things. And I think he's now sped up me as well, so it's like crazy. But yeah, so I just wanted to warn you about that, but that's how we're going to get through this video. My goal has been to try and get through 40 minutes per session, which I'm not sure how realistic that is. Let's see how we do.
More based in the idea that these non-negotiable and inevitable ways of classifying things are just part of some kind of natural hierarchy, and then our politics kind of like follows from that natural. It's the natural way things are.
Okay, so I'm going to pause there because so basically what he said there is attributed to me the belief that definitions are the way they are because it's some kind of natural thing. I wouldn't really say that. I would say that there are objective reasons why it makes sense to define words the way that we do. Like it would just be wrong to say that you can be a vegan while eating a triple bacon cheeseburger. That is my firmly held position. And I don't say that because the word vegan clearly has some kind of inherent natural essence that attaches it to the idea of abstaining from animal products. I say it because I think the purpose of language is to make communication easy. And as such, there are observations we can make about language and the way words are used, from which we can then say, well, if you use it in a different way, that's just objectively wrong. While there are various things I've said before, there are various ways that we can get into what makes something a good definition. The main thing I'd say is obviously it can't be pushing forward any sort of harmful ideas, which I don't think defining a man or woman by biological sex is doing. And it also has to cohere with if we were analyzing reality, we shouldn't find ourselves constantly having to stumble over the fact that we've used these weird, awkward definitions. We're constantly having to clarify things and things like basically, I think the correct definition should make communicating about reality as simple and easy as possible. And I think that is more true of using biological sex as the definition than using any kind of trans-affirming definition. That's my position.
Some definitions are going to be right and some are going to be wrong insofar as they correctly describe the way that people do use words in the ordinary speaking population, right? So insofar as a definition... Okay,
so I know what he's basically going to say. He's going to say basically, so he's going to engage in a purely descriptivist point of view. I would disagree with that. So I think that descriptivism is important, how people use words is important, but I will say right away, I think there are two exceptions to that. The first one, as I said, is morality, right? So basically, if the obvious example would be like people didn't think that black people were like properly people, or people didn't think that Jews were fully people. The fact that people use the word that way doesn't mean they were right. I would say that even if every single person in, like, let's say the American South didn't, obviously in the past, I hope it's slightly better now, and also I realized, of course, actually, I've been a bit ironic, like I said, even if every single person, whereas, of course, presumably this wouldn't be true of the black people, you would imagine, and therefore I've kind of implied in saying that the black people don't qualify as people. So I'll rephrase that just to avoid that ironic kind of situation. So even if every single non-black person in the American South didn't consider black people to be people, since I imagine black people themselves would probably consider themselves to be people. I mean, let's say, for example, they got rid of all the black people in the American South. That makes it easier, because then you'd have a complete society where nobody considers black people to be people. They'd still be wrong, I think, because basically of the morality, I think you can make moral criticisms of particular terms. So, for example, that's the argument I've always made about gay marriage. People say, well, why should we redefine marriage? And my answer would be, well, because marriage is a moral designation. That essentially, by calling something marriage, I think you are validating that relationship moralistically. Therefore, if you're going to say that you refuse to do that for same-sex marriage, then you would have to make a moral argument for why we should not validate same-sex marriages or same-sex relationships in the same way that we would validate, heterosexual relationships. And of course, the alternative is someone can make the counter-argument against you. They could say, well, those marriages can be just as monogamous, or those relationships can be just as monogamous and faithful and positive for society. And, they can start families for adoption. So in so many ways, it seems like, in fact, on every really important sense, it seems like they're very similar to same-sex relationships, heterosexual relationships. So why wouldn't you validate them? That's another example. The other thing I'd say is, if people are using words in a way that analytically confuses things. So one example would be people calling Pluto a planet, like that confuses things, because that's like, well, then you have to say all the other asteroids are planets. And another example is like the way people use the word socialist. Like, a lot of people use the word socialist in a way that doesn't really make much sense. And that's why often, like, the people who seriously actually care about talking about these issues, in a way that's constructive, in a way that fully helps to understand society, will use these definitions in a different way, similar to the word capitalism. And I would say that definition, because it's used by the people who are frankly smarter on the topic, that is the correct definition. The fact that there's loads of people who think that socialism is when the government does stuff, and the more stuff the government does, the more socialist it is, and if it does a real whole load of stuff, it's communism. The fact people think that doesn't change the fact that's not what socialism is. Socialism is when workers control the means of production. It's got nothing to do with how much stuff the government does. The government could do a whole load of stuff under capitalism and it would still be capitalism. In fact, capitalism definitionally is about the government doing stuff. It's about the government protecting private property. So, but that's an example, right? People do act as if, you want universal healthcare free at the point of access. That's socialism. It's like, no, that doesn't, like, having free healthcare doesn't entail the workers controlling the means of production. So yeah, I would say in that situation, that's wrong, because it makes it harder to analyze actual economic systems if we're trying to validate the definitions that are being used by people who just aren't that politically informed. So those are two exceptions I would make to the idea of just, well, if the majority of people use the term that way, this must be valid. I'll see what he says, and if he adds anything else that complicates that, then I will respond to it. But otherwise, if he just goes on to say, well, like, people use the word that way, so clearly that means it's correct or whatever, then what I've just said, I think, stands as the response to that.
Correct here means inevitably, ultimately means, some particular thing, never changes over time, isn't up for grabs or something like that.
And just for record, these things can change. Like, there could be a point at which, I mean, for example, if you're talking about scientific definitions, scientific classifications do change over time, and I would argue those definitions are objectively correct and yet open to change. So yeah, clearly I'm not saying that these definitions can never change. I just think they have to change by something a little bit more substantial than the moral failings of society. Like if society suddenly becomes bigoted and that causes definitions to change, I don't view that as the definition having actually changed. I view that as people changing to being wrong about the definition. Or if the definition changes because, again, people just become less informed on a topic, so they start using the word the wrong way. I don't view that to be definitions changing until it becomes part of a system that does have some kind of analytic utility where, you know, we can then say, well, okay, that is a way that the word's changed. There you go.
Yeah, there's so much to say about this, right? So, for example, right, the term light.
Okay, so here, just for the record, I said, oh, look at that face he's paused on. Embarrassing. It's not, to be fair, like I definitely paused on some weird, funny faces back when I was doing live reactions. So basically, just for context here, I said if something doesn't have necessary and sufficient conditions, then it's not a concept. I'm not going to explain what necessary and sufficient conditions means here. If you don't know that, you'll have to watch this video to see how I describe it, because, yeah, I don't want to make this too long. But he's going to now dispute the idea that something needs necessary and sufficient conditions to be a concept.
Providing necessary and sufficient conditions for the term light is going to be very difficult. We have...
Okay, so I think I'm realizing I'm not particularly interested in responding to this because, yeah, absolutely, I agree. I mean, I've always said before, I don't think that providing a perfect definition for something is particularly realistic and achievable, and therefore I don't think it's really what should be expected in a conversation. And seeing as, you know, basically, if you wanted to shorthand, necessary and sufficient conditions is basically just a more philosophical way of saying a definition, because it's saying what is necessary and sufficient to define something, basically. That's what it means. So since I've said that you don't need a perfect definition, yeah, also we don't need to, in any situation, be able to provide perfectly the necessary and sufficient conditions for a concept. But what I would say is that it still needs, and in the case of light, for example, yeah, I think explaining exactly what the necessary and sufficient conditions are would be difficult. But I wouldn't doubt for a second with light that there are necessary and sufficient conditions to describe it. I think that's a really important distinction to just bear in mind. And again, standard situation, that's his claim, basically, that implying that because it's a difficult thing to define and pin down, therefore it doesn't exist. Obviously, I don't think that's a good argument. The standard argument I always use is like, how many birds are in the sky right now? No one can provide the answer to that question, and yet there is an answer to how many birds are in the sky right now. Like, obviously there's an answer to that question. And, you know, you could say about anything. You could say about like if I held my hand and, you know, I held up a number of fingers, how many fingers am I holding up? You could not possibly know. And yet there is an answer. It's 3. So, and well done if you guessed correctly. Yeah, I think it's pretty easy to prove that just because we can't easily know something and easily communicate something, it doesn't follow that that thing doesn't exist.
The ordinary sense of, you know, the morning light or whatever, which is sort of conceptually disconnected from wavelength, though in someone who understands physics, of course, those...
So I'll just say all he's adding here is that light can also mean different things, or can be used in different ways. For the record, I would say in that context, like what I would really say is that at that point you're talking about different concepts. So I obviously said something like basically needs these things in order to be a concept. It's possible that the same word could describe different concepts, so that like there's all sorts of different ways that this word can be used. Yeah, that just proves that you need multiple ways to describe the different concepts, which is not in contradiction of anything I said.
You know, append an extra necessary jointly an extra necessary and jointly sufficient condition to the...
So he's been talking about this for a while, but he's basically just giving more examples where there are complicated definitions. Now he's talking about like how we conceptually define knowledge. Again, like I'll just explain where I'm coming from here. The fact that we use a word, to me, shows that on some level we know what that word means. I don't think it's possible that we use any word I'm saying right now. I don't think it's possible that there is any word coming out of my mouth right now that does not have a perfect definition. Because if it didn't have a perfect definition, I wouldn't be able to use it in a sentence. Now, having said that, for any word I'm saying right now, I don't know whether I could tell you a perfect definition of it. I'm just saying that definition must exist, because essentially the perfect definition would be a definition that encapsulates all of the legitimate ways a word can be used and excludes all the ways that word can't really be used. And that is easily a possible thing to find and work out. and I wouldn't doubt for a second that's true. So, yeah, there we go. Simple, basic.
Recent video about how trans activists generally aren't able to define any of the terms they use, and therefore
Am I really out of sync all of a sudden?
don't really have a conception of anything. So just to clarify, so we're all clear here,
You know what, actually, I'll say this right now. For some reason, I think all of my videos end up slightly out of sync. And the reason why is because I edit things on Sony Vegas. On the Sony Vegas display thing, I get it so it looks perfectly in sync. And I don't know whether it's that the Sony Vegas display thing is off, or whether it's the fact that when I do the rendering, for some reason that puts it slightly off. But I do notice it. I notice that my videos, and you obviously will be, well, if it's slightly off every single time, just fix it. But like, I don't want to overcorrect because that could be embarrassing. I guess the other issue is that recently, I'm ashamed to admit, I haven't actually been finishing my videos with enough time to spare that I've had any real time to play around with like rendering it all sorts of different ways. So if I did try to move it and I screwed up the render, that would be awkward. But yeah, I am aware of it, the fact that it's slightly off, and I'm not sure what the solution there is.
Well, that is sort of question begging a little bit. I mean, obviously that is his point of view, but I think that
so basically here he's just objected to the fact that while I'm explaining, so I was explaining what necessary and sufficient conditions are, and basically the way I explained it was in a way where I was giving as an example the fact that a man is an adult human male. And he's saying, well, obviously, like, I'm assuming my answer is correct. Obviously, just for record, I was explaining there the definition for the benefit of the people watching my content so they could understand what it meant. So I wasn't presenting that as an argument for the idea that being an adult human male is, the definition of a man.
And then sometimes there's, words that function as nouns and verbs.
Yeah, so again, I mean, I don't know, maybe I didn't communicate as clearly. Maybe I said some things that implied something other than this. I wouldn't deny for a second that it's possible to have a word have multiple meanings. Like, what I would say when I talk about a definition is that I think it's possible to have multiple definitions, because you can have a word and then you can say definition 1, definition 2, definition 3. But what I say is all three of those definitions need to basically explain how that word is being used in that sense in a way that includes all things that aren't that would be being described by the way the word's being used, and exclude all things that aren't. So if you take all of those definitions together, you have kind of one macro definition that does actually say, well, if it's this or this or this, then it's this thing. And if it's this or this or this, then there's no way it couldn't be this thing. And if it's not this or this or this, then there's no way it could be this thing. Like, that's what I think a definition should be.
I'm just going to respond to one comment where it's saying King Critical tends to get tediously into the weeds, but his ultimate conclusions are correct on the issue. Well,
ooh, interesting. I think I actually know that person, Keiko. I think that's Cody Code. No, Cody Code. Does anyone know about the Cody Code drama? Basically, he's a pedophile.
Well, so far, I think he's been right about a couple of criticisms of Stephen, but his views are actually profoundly mistaken.
Yeah, I don't really think, actually, like, as much as I'm watching him respond to this, I don't think there's much to be gained from watching him respond to somebody just saying, like, this person's correct. Like, maybe I'll see if he gives, like, a specific argument that he hasn't already given, but I don't know why he would, because you'd think he would just be restating. Like, so we'll see.
For prejudices, and it seems like you were just saying, yeah, I agree with the prejudices held in the first place, and that's the important bit, and I don't get why we don't just have that discussion, right? Which is,
I will say, like, if anybody is actually enjoying my content or thinks I'm right because I validate their pre-held conclusions, that is a shame. And I think that must be true to some extent. And the reason I say I think that must be true is because I strongly feel I'm about to run out of space. The reason I think that's true is because, obviously I've made videos where I've gone beyond the trans activist thing. The recent example being, of course, my video where I dunked on racism with facts and logic. And it's hard to say, like, what percentage of people who've responded negatively to that are people who otherwise like my content. But I have to say that I feel like I've made the exact same quality of arguments that I would make against trans identity. But there have been a few examples like that where, from my perspective, I feel like the quality of my arguments is the same for most things that I've spoken about on this channel. So whenever, like, I make a video about a topic that's not related to trans identity at all, and I get responses that demonstrate just a, because I suppose the thing is, it's not just that they disagree. I'm not like, oh, well, obviously they'd have to see my arguments and realize how fantastic they are, and therefore they wouldn't disagree with me. Like, I think that's unreasonable. But to see comments that indicate people haven't even understood my argument, that's a problem. Because then I think, well, hold on a minute. If they haven't even understood my argument around this topic, do they even understand my argument around trans identity? Or is it a case that they're literally just like, well, this person agrees with me, and therefore I think he's great? Because, you know, I've said with trans activists before, I can't think what the video was, but I think it might have been a Lily Alexandra video. But I was saying, like, I would love to just sit down with someone who enjoyed this video and ask them just what point they think the video made. I can't remember if it was that video, but it was definitely one video where I was thinking to myself, like, and it had like a good number of views, a good number of likes on the video, a good number of positive comments. And I was thinking, I would love to sit someone down and just ask them, okay, you really like this video. What arguments do you think this video made? What was the key claim it was addressing, and how did it address that claim? And because you would think, if you're enjoying a video that is supposed to be almost entirely committed to arguing a point, you'd be able to explain, you know, why it is you like the video on those grounds. And the issue is that I think we have to be aware that, you know, it's not just that, like, every single person who disagrees with us, whatever your position is on anything, it's not that every single person who disagrees with you has this unique inability to engage with arguments in a way that you would say makes sense or anything like that. And then everyone who agrees with you is just really smart and able to engage with arguments. No, it has to be almost inescapably true that a lot of the people who agree with you also aren't that able to engage with arguments. But it just so happens you don't notice it as much because your arguments lead you to the same conclusion as them. And there probably are some people who do watch my content and they couldn't even tell you what the argument was I was making in the video, I'm sure. But obviously I'm not saying that this person is specifically Keiko. I don't think that's true of them. But yeah, it probably is true. There are some people who maybe don't actually care about the arguments I make as much as I would like them to, because they do just think, well, I agree with this person and that's why he's right. And therefore, if I make, you know, an argument about something they don't agree with, they will not engage with the arguments I've made and just be like, well, now I disagree with this person, so he's wrong.
Do you think it's wrong for someone to wear the clothes of the opposite sex or something like that?
Yeah, so I've already pointed out before, he's been like claiming this whole time that the opposition to trans identity is actually about a kind of bigotry, a reflexive bigotry, and that's just not true. I don't have a problem with the way people choose to dress, what clothes people choose to wear. I'm sure you don't either. So he's just wrong on this point, which is something he should work on.
Doesn't really work. You know, the whole point is to say, what?
Again, I don't think, you know, given my sort of
long hair jump scare.
different views about language, I don't think that including the word typically is that problematic. I think
that makes sense. So basically, because obviously my issue of using the word typically is that I do think a definition needs to categorically, I said this before, include all things that are being described by a term and exclude all things that aren't. And within that context, saying typically it just doesn't work, because it's like, again, the problem is you have and I think I actually addressed this later on in the video, so I think I'm just repeating an argument that I make there, which is, well, if you then have something that doesn't fit the definition, is that because it isn't the thing, or it's just not a typical example of that thing?
You know, a word like fascism, multiple people have written academic article or liberal.
Oh, this is really interesting, because in a recent video, I complained about it in the Jessie Jenner video. I hope it's not something that ended up on the cutting room floor, because there are things that do, especially if I feel like they're unnecessarily kind of labouring a point. But basically, I know a lot of people might think I unnecessarily labour points already, but you know, just imagine. Basically, I complained about the idea that the definition of fascism is just a pick and mix thing, where it's just like a list of points, and you kind of just like, you take something, it's like, oh well, if it's got that and that and that. Whereas I would argue that a good definition of fascism needs to be much more holistic and centered around one. And I do have a definition of fascism, but yeah, it's ironic that he brings up fascism, because fascism is one of my go-to examples of where people treat it like a checkbox. and they just say, well, is this thing fascist? And like, well, it's got, nationalization or like, nationalism. It's got strong military, blah, blah, blah. But it's like a lot of those things, I think it's wrong to think of that as like getting you closer to fascism. I'd say fascism is quite a definitive thing. And that's kind of my position.
That kind of ambiguity that genuinely exists, which is part of the whole reason why people debate these contested terms, right?
Yeah, I don't know. For me, I just feel like the issue is, like, let's say you say, well, fascism, it's typically got a strong military presence. Well, the issue is, okay, well, in that case, I guess you could have fascism without any strong military presence whatsoever, and then it would just be an atypical example of fascism. But then it's like, okay, so pretty much then you've not actually achieved anything with that definition, right? Because then it's like, and if you go through the whole thing, it's like, couldn't you just say, well, America, or like, I don't know, America under, I was going to say like someone relatively not good. The thing is, there's no example I can give where people would be like, yeah, they are fascists. So I'm not sure. Like, there's no example. Like, one of the problems is it's pretty difficult to give an example where there won't be some people like, oh yeah, it is fascist. But I'm just going to take America. Like, you could literally say, well, America is fascist because just every single point where it doesn't meet the definition, you just say, well, it's because it's not a typical example of fascism. So it means that functionally the definition does become useless. Because, yeah, how do you actually make that distinction between not that thing and an atypical example of that thing?
And what most people mean by water does not involve any of the understanding of chemistry, the concept of water for most people. Maybe includes H2O because...
Okay, I feel like this is not really a response. Like, this doesn't seem to have anything to do with the use of the word typically here. But like, this is more about, and this is again something I definitely covered in the Jesse gender video, the question of like, if there is a scientific underpinning for something that people aren't necessarily aware of or thinking of in their colloquial use of the term, does that mean that that's therefore not part of the definition? And I think I showed in my Jesse gender video that doesn't really make sense. That in fact, a lot of the time, people use words in a way that doesn't immediately relate to the scientific definition, but you can't, I think, therefore argue that the way people casually use the word is more true as a definition than the definition is actually categorical and is ultimately what people are alluding to when they use the word their own way, basically.
A concept that's going to be characterized almost functionally in something that they interact with in a particular kind of way, something. So
I don't think that's a particularly intelligent point. Sorry, because essentially the argument, so I'm drinking water, right? Well, no, I'm not, because I know this water tastes different from water in other places. It has its own profile. There are people who literally taste water, which is both crazy, but something that completely makes sense because water can have minerals and things like that in it. But here's the problem, okay? You want to say, oh, well, you're not actually drinking water then, or like in some sense that shows that your definition doesn't make sense. But then, you could say, for example, oh, I'm having roast beef for dinner. Okay, well, first of all, are you actually having roast beef for dinner? Well, no, because you're having like potatoes too, and gravy, and like some kind of green vegetables, so on and so forth. So that's not true. But then also you could be like, well, when you think about it, when you swallow the roast beef, you're getting some oxygen in your mouth. And actually, there's got to be some fine dust particles, like, just floating around the air. Some of those dust particles are going to land on your roast beef and, hopefully it doesn't put you off too much. But there's going to be things like that. People talk about, if you have chicken stock, there's impurities in it. The reality is that I don't think it's a particularly important point or communicates anything particularly like significant or controversial, that we use words when we talk about like consuming things or many other contexts. We use words to basically describe the vast majority of what it is we're consuming, and we don't really pay any mind towards the fact that we're also consuming certain other, impurities, or in the case of water, I think the impurities are part of the fun and they're actually quite good for you. Like, usually mineral water and things like that with all the magnesium and whatever's in it, like that's supposed to be like good. You're getting, well, minerals. That's why it's called mineral water. Nobody is going to say, well, I'm drinking water with, and then list off every single, with calcium and blah, blah, blah. I don't think that contradicts the fact that people still recognize what water is, basically. In the exact same way that, you know, if someone's eating roast beef, but they know that there's probably going to be some other non-roast beef stuff in their roast beef, like, that doesn't tear apart the definition of roast beef. We know what they're talking about. They're just ignoring the tiny amount of, like, trace other stuff in there.
That's just question begging, right? Where again, we need to look at particular cases and we find counterexamples to this.
Oh, that's not question begging. So basically what I'm saying here is that it doesn't make sense to say that a platypus contradicts or, like, adds atypically to definition of mammal, because then you say, well, how on earth do we then say that anything isn't a mammal? Once you open up the idea of, like, well, a mammal is this very specific thing, but now we have a platypus that basically, like, that contradicts a core thing, but we're still going to say it's a mammal. If that's how you describe it, if you describe it in those terms, it's just, well, we have an exception, so now we're just going to say, oh, there can be exceptions now. Well, at that point, why can't literally anything be an exception? I don't think that's question begging. I think it's a very legitimate question to ask.
This is not how we teach children language, by the way.
This thing, fine.
I think that seems like a weird argument. Yeah, okay, it's not how we teach children language. Yeah, I know that.
Defining, like, that typically men.
Like, yeah, no, like, the weird thing about saying that's not how we teach children language is because, like, we don't really, I mean, I actually genuinely think, like, a real problem is that children don't learn linguistics, one, and they also don't learn philosophy of language. I was thinking about this recently, and I am going to allow myself a little bit of a tangent here. I cut out a massive tangent earlier, by the way. You should know it was when I was speaking about water, I'm not going to repeat the tangent, but I basically went on, like, a big rant about, like, different places where water tastes differently and, like, these socioeconomic reasons why I think, like, certain places don't have good tasting water. And I was like, no, I'm gonna cut that. So just so you know, you missed out on that. But I am gonna talk about, like, why I think we should teach kids linguistics, because I was thinking about it recently. I think learning linguistics is probably one of the best ways to help children overcome what I think is a big problem for a lot of people, which is their own egos, right? Like, basically what I mean there is it's really difficult. It's really difficult for anyone, myself included. But I think because I'm aware of this as a big problem, I think I've tried to overcome this. And I would think maybe, like, if you're kind of a more thoughtful person, you've probably done a lot more to overcome this. But even then, I think there are lots of people who masquerade as thoughtful people who haven't done this. When I say overcome your own egos, I mean, think about things outside of yourself and realize how different other people's experiences can be based on where they're starting from and things like that. It's like a really important thing. And I think a really good example of that is linguistics, because when you look at people who don't understand linguistics, you realize that the huge issue, like something I see all the time, is Americans and British people trying to explain the way they pronounce things and the logic for why they pronounce things in ways that I've actually mentioned this before, actually. Like, I realized I've done this whole rant before about how, basically, oh god, yeah, I'm realizing I've literally spoken about this before on Patreon as well. So I don't really need to go through it again. Basically just communicating with each other in a way that makes it clear that they just don't understand the fact that for an American, their frame of reference for how things should be pronounced is going to be completely different because they pronounce all sorts of vowel sounds differently. Whereas obviously for a British person, the exact same thing. So I often see British people say to an American, to make them understand that something should be pronounced as like an or sound, they will appeal to a word that's spelled like or, like, you know, literally like or in the context of and or. The problem is for an American, they don't pronounce it or, they pronounce it or, kind of like that, or. So yeah, like an or, like source. For a British person, we would say that's source. So it's too different. But like, it's almost like this attitude of British people will be like, and Americans do this too in the reverse, but British people will be like, oh, come on, Americans, you know this. You know that source is pronounced sauce. Like, as if we think like they've just failed to understand the fact that it's not pronounced source, it's pronounced sauce. But no, obviously it's their accent, and that's a completely legitimate way to pronounce things. I had someone recently on one of my videos say that I pronounce Vorsh wrong, and they're saying it's not pronounced Vorsh, it's pronounced Varsh, and I was like, well, no, because like that's weird to me, because like it's AU, and in any other context, like in the word source, like SAUCE, or author or something like that, I pronounce it or, source, author, Vorsh. I wouldn't pronounce it Sars, Arthur, Varsh. Like to me, that doesn't make any sense to say like I'm pronouncing Vorsh's name wrong, because to me, if I said Vosh, hey, I'm going to respond to Vosh. Like that sounds American, right? The exact same way if I said, oh, hey guys, today I'm going to be eating some applesauce, and I don't know, I can't think of other words, but you can see I caught some applesauce. I caught Vosh eating applesauce. Like that doesn't work anyway. Sorry. So you see what I'm saying there? Just on the subject of like teaching kids language. The other thing I think we should teach them is like philosophy of language. But yeah, just saying that.
Now,
and particularly if we look at scientific kinds, I mean, they're being revised like this all the time. If you trace, the history of a term like atom, I mean, why is it even
look,
called?
I will say this. So he's saying like, oh, scientific terms would be revised all the time. For record, what I'm talking about, so I'm still on the point of like, we can use the word typically in some contexts, but it doesn't make sense to say that the true definition has the word typically in it. Because again, that just doesn't make any sense. How would you distinguish between not that thing and atypical example of that thing, as I've said several times? But he's saying that, well, these definitions in science will be defined and refined all the time. Like, that's what I support. Yeah, like, I think essentially, like, he's actually backing up what I'm saying here, because the argument that people are that I'm responding to is the idea of like, well, duck-billed platypus don't give birth to live young, therefore we need to throw in the word typically. Mammals give birth to live young. Like, we need to throw the word typically in there, which to me is lazy, and it's basically just responding to an exception by just saying, oh, well, sometimes it's not, which I think is an incredibly lazy thing to do, right? Like, that would be lazy, of course. If you like come up with a scientific theory and then you find out something that contradicts that scientific theory, and you just say, okay, well, I'm going to revise my scientific theory. Sometimes this happens, but sometimes it doesn't. Like, that's essentially what you're doing in saying like, oh, I'm just going to add the word typically to this definition. Like, this thing is true, but sometimes it isn't. Whereas, of course, the alternative of like refining and redefining your definition to account for all these exceptions, that's what I'm saying we should do. That when we see something that contradicts a way we've been using the word before, we should bring that in and we should incorporate it, and we should come up with a definition that makes sense, that works with other definitions. Like, I think that's great, that process of testing a definition and refining it. And if we find something that contradicts that definition but doesn't feel like it should contradict that definition, we think, well, what's wrong here? Like, clearly, are our observations wrong, or do we need to redefine the definition? That's a great thing to do. And it's precisely because I recognize that's a good thing to do that I'm so resistant to the idea of just saying, oh, okay, well, just typically this thing's the case. Which, of course, is just a complete cop-out.
Called atom, right? Well, it's been called atom because there was some experimental data, and Democritus, the ancient Greek, had this theory of the smallest indivisible part of reality, of material reality. And that's what...
Yeah, look, I mean, so the thing is, so all these like talks about like, so here he's talking about like the atom and like how the word atom came to like, it mean one thing, like it meant like a theoretical thing. And then later on we realized what it actually was and blah, blah, blah. Or it was like a kind of speculative thing. Like people were like, oh, well, like, there's probably like this thing called an atom. And then like eventually we worked out what it was. And that like shows how terms change and things like that. The thing is, I'm going to say this just right now, every single way we can conceive of how words change, it always works to my benefit, or always works to the benefit of the gender critical position. I've not seen any example given of like, well, here's a way we use terms, here's a way we understand language, and not thought, yeah, and that exactly precisely backs up why we should continue treating words and definitions that way, with regards to the definition of the word woman, which, would lead to us arriving at the adult human female definition.
Discussion is way outside of my field of expertise, to be honest. But I mean, can't they just settle it by appealing to the definition?
So yeah, a complete basically what he just did was, I don't know, like, I'm gonna sound a bit derisive, and I apologize. What he just did was he went onto an AI thing and he just said, are there any examples of mammals that are controversial in terms of their classification, basically? And then he got a load of examples, and this is what he was doing for the past few minutes. And then, of course, as you've seen, he said, well, can't they just settle this by appealing to definition? Again, a complete misrepresentation of my point of view. I never said that there is a definition that completely hangs over our observations. What I'm saying is that there is an interplay between definitions and our observations. So we might observe something, to fit with a particular classification, and then we factor that into classification, and when we factor that into classification, we realize other things it makes sense to fit into that too. Like I've never ever said any of this, and it's just, I mean, I've kind of already said it. Every single example you can give of like, actually, this is how language works. Every single one of those examples completely lines up with what I'm saying, which is that, yeah, okay, we should have the definition of adult human female. And if we realize complexities there, if we realize examples of where we might need to refine that definition, we absolutely should. But none of this is an argument for the idea. Like, please don't forget what we're really talking about here. It would be easy to, because we haven't really focused on it at all in this video. We're talking about the question, can a biological male just identify as a woman and as such become a woman? And we have not seen any arguments to that effect in this video. And certainly, yeah, like this idea that, well, we just refine definitions and what we magically discover biological males can be women. No, I don't think that makes much sense.
Why are these biologists?
I just had I am just realizing the fact. It feels like we haven't spoken about that much this video, and part of that's been because I've been trying to I've been skipping over stuff, not because it's been interesting stuff worth responding to, but because there was nothing worth responding to, so I'm kind of trying to get through it as quickly as possible to get to the good stuff. But I'm realizing we haven't actually said very much about trans identity at all here.
Woodford's definition doesn't. One of Woodford's objections to defining man and woman with reference to biological sex is that in the past, people wouldn't have known about some of the ways that we understand biological sex right now. So,
okay, so this is literally... so this is something we've already covered before, right? He already made that argument, right? That we used to talk about water before we knew what H2O was. And of course, Jesse Gender's already spoken about that. So this is clearly something I'm used to covering. This thing of well, we didn't know about the stuff before, therefore it's not part of the definition. I just don't think that's a legitimate way of understanding things.
That we are providing qualitative classifications of things that we experience and learning to use language in that way. And that's why.
No, yeah. So basically, he's just saying well, I think what he's saying here is it works better with me, but I don't see why he's saying that, because basically all I'm saying is, so what I just said was that there are certain things I observe that might indicate somebody's a woman, but they don't prove somebody's a woman, or they're not part of the definition. The example I gave was large breasts. If I see someone with large breasts, that is a strong indication they are a woman. But that doesn't demonstrate they're a woman. That is not in itself enough to conclude they are a woman. He's saying, well, that better fits with his definition or his understanding of definitions. It really doesn't, because it fits just as well with the adult human female definition, right? A woman is an adult human female. That is a very set in stone thing that, well, I shouldn't say set in stone, because I mean, it can be refined, but it needs to be refined based on observations about the complexities of biological sex and stuff like that, rather than being redefined just by people saying, well, I feel like I'm a woman, therefore I'm a woman, because that doesn't make any sense. That's where I'm coming from. Within that context, well, that works perfectly with me saying large breasts are an indication someone's a woman, but they don't prove that they're a woman, because large breasts are an indication of being biologically female, but that's not part of the definition of being biologically female. Especially if, of course, we're allowing for the possibility that these are surgically enhanced large breasts. So that works. I don't see how that contradicts my definition, or is an attitude that is better served by considering his definition as opposed to the definition that I'm offering up.
The gene or function, or it's going to have to become potential function, because of course if someone did not actualize that function.
All right, look, so I'm gonna have to pause. So this is not responding to directly what he said, because one of the problems is sometimes he'll say something and then I let it play to see if he elaborates on it, and then he doesn't, and then I'm like, okay, do I go back? Oh, fuck it, I will go back, even though I could just explain.
Not this one part there is, whereas that has large breasts, right? Upon learning that someone has large breasts, we can assume that they're a woman quite safely, whereas that's still not a necessary condition, right? It's because there are jointly sufficient conditions. Now there's a view.
Okay, yeah. So that's what I wanted. So he says there are jointly sufficient conditions, or rather, the reason why having large breasts isn't a necessary sufficient condition in itself is because they're jointly sufficient conditions. So it seems like what he's saying there is that having large breasts is part of the definition, but it's not enough on its own. I would disagree, because to say it's part of the definition would be to say that if I went out and got a boob job tomorrow, I assume there'd probably be a bit more of a process to it than that, but I literally, maybe I met a dodgy surgeon, I said, oh, give me breast implants. Would that now make me partially a woman? Would it make me more of a woman? Would it make me more of a biological female? I don't think so. It would make me a man with breast implants, right? So this argument, like that, like his perspective, and this is why, again, I was talking about this before, it's the problem with the pick and mix mentality as opposed to the holistic mentality. That is one of, I think one of the things that we need to understand, especially if we're going to kind of advance the gender critical debate, is that a lot of the time we're talking about core axiomatic differences in terms of how we conceive of definitions. And one of the big ones, I'd say, is the pick and mix mentality versus the holistic mentality. The pick and mix mentality being, well, you have a vagina and big boobs and XX chromosomes and estrogen and wide hips. And these are all just like a part of a collage or like a checkbox of being a woman. And like that carries with it the implication that someone becomes more of a woman if they've got more of these things, and less of a woman if they don't. And like people can add these things on and like, or almost like kind of building a like a CV or something like that. If you just like, oh, I've got, you know, I got the large breast, tick that off. That's the way that a lot of trans activists want to conceive of this stuff, which I think is wrong. And then you have the holistic definition, which is say, well, all these things, sure, they matter, but the question is, they matter because they are telling a wider story about what this person's body is doing, the function, and that's kind of my main focus. That sometimes all of the noise of the various different attributes, it's needlessly confused by understanding them all as if they're kind of just unrelated to each other. Just, oh, you got this or this or this or this or this. And I think it's helpful to understand that they're centered around something, which is just one singular thing, usually function, but it could be other stuff as well.
Then that definition means this person 100 as a racial analogy or their biological sex. I think I and any other person who has any kind of sexuality would be much.
So he just massively skipped through a whole lot of my video, which is interesting.
Is it because individuals who identify as women have been historically oppressed? Well, not really, because biological females have been historically oppressed.
You know what's really annoying me? This is actually like an interesting, like, so now we're getting into the question of why does it matter we define things by biological sex? And we're really, like, we're already past the point where I should have stopped recording. We're not quite, you see, we're at, I wanted to reach 1 hour, 20 minutes so that we could keep up with the idea that we're going to finish this in 3 parts. But I'm really concerned because either he's now going to start responding to the really important stuff, in which case I would like to respond to it, in which case it's going to take us a lot longer to get through this final 4 minutes, or he's not going to, in which case that's very depressing because it means, none of this video is going to have been addressing any sort of interesting topic because he's now responding to like another bigger topic. And realistically, you know, I don't want to be rushing that, which right now I'm in a mentality of just rushing things because I was trying to like get as much progress done as possible. You know, it's always annoying when somebody kind of says something interesting or like starts to engage with a topic that's more interesting to me right towards the end of a recording session, because in my brain I'm already like, oh, I'm kind of, you know, I'm kind of in the mentality of wanting it to finish. So I am just going to let it finish. And next week, if you guys do vote to respond, to continue responding to this, then we will address that. Again, I will remember to put up the voting next week. I apologize I didn't this time. And in a sense, I wouldn't be surprised if you guys didn't vote to continue this next week, because I don't think this has been that interesting. Like it hasn't felt that interesting as I've been doing it. Having said it, if you guys are interested, I'll happily continue responding to it. You know, it's not the first time I've responded to a video and I thought, I'm not really getting that much out of this, in terms of like challenge or anything like that. But maybe you guys are enjoying it. So, yeah, I mean, honestly, like I feel like this will be quite a short video once I've edited it down. I probably could have included that whole rant about, the quality of water in certain places, but it's not going to be in there. So, hopefully this was shorter and I hope you enjoyed that. Maybe it wasn't. I don't know. I didn't feel like I've said that much, but maybe I just said a whole lot of nothing. All right. See you guys next week. Bye.